Alrighty, we're going to talk right now about American federalism, decentralism, state rights versus centralism or nationalist. Okay, so the first one, let's take a look at. Well, the question I want you to think about when we're doing this is which view is better? Which view, in your opinion, is better and why? So when we get done with doing number 1 and 2, just think of, before we get to the McCullough versus Maryland, which view do you think would be better? Which view would which view do you stand by? And I want you to tell me why. Let's first take a look at the decentralist approach, the states' rights approach. And the states' rights approach would be the Constitution is a compact created by the states that implies strong state authority. Again, who is this in history? Was this the Federalist or Anti-Federalist? And who would this be today, Republican or Democrat? Which one do you think? The second one, Constitution carefully limits national authority to delegated powers. And we're going to get into today what some of the delegated powers are and who has the right to do those things. 10th Amendment, very, very important. This gives broad power to the states. If you remember the 10th Amendment, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. And so again, powers not stated in the Constitution, the states have the right to do and use this. And like we talked about, some of those decisions have to do with morals and ethics and things of this nature. The second one, or D, when in doubt as to which holds power, matters should be resolved in favor of the states. So that's if there's a conflict between the states and the federal government, that the matter should always go back to the states. E implies strict constructionist approach to the Constitution. Not a broad interpretation, just what the Constitution says is what the Constitution says. And so, again, that is the approach there. And again, who does this sound like politically? F, the national government has gotten too big and impersonal. So the national government, again, the people that are arguing for state rights think that the national government does not know what each state needs and those people. State governments are closer to the people, which is, again, true, and followers of this are Goldwater, Reagan, Southern conservatives, Western conservatives, fundamentalists, Newt Gingrich, Bush, things of this nature. So the states' rights approach, as if you can tell, happens to be, again, more of a Republican approach. Now, the centralist approach, the nationalist approach. Constitution created by people, we the people, and not the states. So again, the states are not the ones with the power, but the national government is. Two things really important here, a couple things really important here to remember is the Elastic Clause and the Commerce Clause. And what are the Elastic Clause and the Commerce Clause? Well, you look up the Commerce Clause, but the Commerce Clause has to do with trade and the power to trade and regulation between states and the federal government. They have the power to do that. Elastic Clause, if you remember, it's Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which authorizes Congress to pass all laws, very important here, necessary and proper to carry out the enumerated powers. Enumerated powers are powers that the federal government are the powers that are designed specifically for the federal government in the Constitution. So Elastic Clause, I would underline it and then write down next to it, necessary and proper clause. This gives states, this gives the national government a lot of power here. Very, very, very important is B. Circle B. C. Powers go to the states only if they have been surrendered by national government. That is, if the national government doesn't really care about those, and then those powers can go to the states. Kind of a different interpretation of the 10th Amendment, but yet still there. When in doubt, however, notice the differences here. Matters should be resolved in favor of national government, not the state government, in their opinion. Because, again, national government is stronger than state government. Implies loose interpretation or constructionist approach to Constitution. Again, that can be interpreted broadly. Size of federal bureaucracy has remained relative over the last 40 years. While state governments may be closer to people, some of the state governments have violated personal basic rights. Look at the South, voting rights, Plessy versus Ferguson, and those things. The national government has been a key factor to protecting these rights. What else can you list that the national government has protected rights for the people? What else can you think of? List that at the end of this. Go back, put a little quotation there. And then followers of this, as you can see, are Hamilton, Marshall, Webster, TR, FDR, JFK, LBJ, Clinton, and Obama. So obviously this is more of a democratic approach. The way you can look at this is big government versus small government. Big government versus small government. And so that's the way you want to look at those. Now let's take a look at this court case right here. Very, very, very important. The reason why it's going to be very important is because McCulloch versus Maryland is going to set precedent for two things, two principles within the Constitution it's going to give us. The facts behind the case is Maryland attempted to tax a branch of the Bank of the United States. Well, again, Maryland's a state. The United States has a bank. They're nationalists. So state is trying to tax national government. Their argument is that taxing was one of the reserved powers for the states. And they argued the bank was unconstitutional because it was not stated they didn't have that right in the enumerated powers to do certain things. The court's decision, now this is under the Marshall Court, and the Marshall Court also had, I referred to them as the M&M boys, and the decisions that they had. So they have Marbury versus Madison, and now McCulloch versus Maryland. And so the decisions, the three precedents that it sets that we're going to talk about right now is, number one, it establishes, again, the necessary and proper clause, the elastic clause. Number two, states can't tax the Fed. And three, very important here, central government over state governments. Central over state governments. Central over state. Again, so number one, it says need for a more flexible interpretation of the Constitution so it would endure. The bank was necessary and proper establishment of the quote-unquote implied powers. Implied powers are powers of the federal government that go beyond those enumerated in the Constitution. And so Congress has the power to make all laws necessary and proper for carrying out into execution the powers enumerated in Article 1. So just because it doesn't say it in Article 1, they still have the necessary and proper powers to do so, to carry those out, just because that's sometimes the best for the nation. Look at it, what they're arguing here is the Constitution did not enumerate creating a bank. However, Congress has the power to make all laws necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. Again, those implied powers. We needed a national bank to do that. So Maryland did not have the right to tax us. The second thing here, again, it kind of goes along with the three precedents, is the power to tax involves the power to destroy. States clearly are not free to destroy the national government. States can't tax the national government. Establishes national supremacy. Again, there's the central government over state governments. The supremacy clause. Supremacy clause, supremacy clause, supremacy clause. What does the supremacy clause state? The supremacy clause of the Constitution makes that the Constitution, the national laws and treaties supreme over state laws as long as the national government is acting within accordance of this constitutional limits. It's Article 6 of the Constitution. The laws go as follows. The supreme law of the land is 1, the Constitution, 2, laws of the national government, again, when consistent with the Constitution, and then 3, treaties, which can be made only by the national government. So that's where we're at right there. Now, sources of national strength. We talked about some of this stuff already in our last thing. But the elastic clause, Congress can make all laws necessary and proper to carry out expressed powers. We'll talk about what that is. Again, the war powers, that's for the national government, not state governments. Otherwise, California, we probably would attack Oregon and Nevada, whatever states close to us and just destroy, because we are super. The commerce clause, virtually anything in interstate is interstate or foreign commerce. That means we have the power to do that. Congress can regulate virtually anything under the commerce clause because it has to deal with trade and money. Otherwise, again, you have states regulating it, and it leads us back to the Articles of Confederation and one of the weaknesses there. So that's why that was established. Think of this stuff as to why do we establish this and why do we have this. D, the power to tax and spend for the common defense of the general welfare. So again, we have the power to do that, and this gives our Congress and gives our government national strength. What we're going to be talking about here is number 2. Well, number 1 says Congress cannot technically legislate on anything. It can spend funds on virtually everything. We're going to get into that later in the semester. But number 2 is very important because that's what we're going to be talking about next, and that's called fiscal federalism. And that is, the states don't have to accept federal money, but if they do, they must follow federal guidelines. The federal highway funds can be denied. We already talked about this. And that had to do with denied if a state's alcohol purchasing age is less than 21. The Fed education funds can be denied if states do not comply with No Child Left Behind. We talked about those two on the last notes that we had on federalism. These strings are attached to federal funds, which show to get the federal government what they want. It's called blackmail. So just realize that. And we'll talk about E and F. So this is all about state rights versus national rights. Now I'm going to quickly go over here to the recent developments, and that's the devolution. The devil in devolution, if you remember that article, and the evolution towards greater federal control through most of the 20th century. That's what we have. But Nixon, the new federalism, returned power back to the states, and that's what the devolution revolution is. It's the new federalism. We're giving power back to the states, favored by Reagan, both Bushes, and the Republican Party in general, because the Republican parties want a stronger state government. In 1994, Newt Gingrich, the gentleman who was just running for president, had a contract with America, and he put, again, devolution, the power back to the states. These are some of the things that he did. The Unfunded Mandate Act in 1994 restricted future unfunded mandates. Why do you do this? You know, again, all these things are making federal government smaller. 2, the use of block grants to replace categorical grants. We'll talk about that here next. That's fiscal federalism. The 1996 welfare reform bill that ended welfare as federal entitlement, which means federal spending. You have to spend certain money. Bill Clinton was the one who did this. We'll talk more about this later on, and we've already discussed some of it, but it totally revolutionized welfare and the welfare program. And the repeal of the 55-mile speed limit. Now, this lets states decide. Again, Arizona is what, 75 miles an hour. California, we have 65. Some areas of I-5 at 70 miles an hour. And then here's some Supreme Court actions consistent with devolution. I apologize, I'm going fast. I only got a couple minutes here. You got the Gun-Free Zones Act that was struck down in 1995 in U.S. versus Lopez. Congress overextended itself and it linked gun control laws to the Interstate Commerce Clause. This was struck down. This was saying you can't transport a gun within a mile of the school, but what happens across the street if you have people that live there, so they can't get a gun? So Congress overextended itself there with this, again, giving more power back to the states. Number 2, struck down part of the Violence Against Women's Act in U.S. versus Morrison, saying that rape victims could not sue their attackers in federal court because it was up to the states, not Congress, to give such help to women victimized by violence. Again, the court said that the Congress overextended itself with the use of the Interstate Commerce Clause in passing the act. So the Interstate Commerce Clause is one of those clauses that they use a lot in order to get their way into establish national government over state rights. But again, these are overturning that, giving us back to state rights in the devolution revolution. 3, struck down Religious Freedom Restoration Act 1983. This act had restricted the power of states to regulate religion. This ruling gave states greater authority in regulating religion. This becomes a state issue, not a federal issue. Very important. 4, struck down Brady Act in 1997 that required local law enforcement agencies to do background checks on gun buyers. Now it's a state issue. It's a new state issue. And so, again, you can't make it a federal issue. And then upheld an Indian law that required photo ID for voting. And so all these things from and E, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are all state issues in dealing with the devolution revolution, giving more power back to the states.